All right, so again, thumbnails in your sketchbook first. So what I did is I drew a frame for each of my thumbnails to help me figure out composition within my larger sheet for my final. Does that make sense? If I'm working on an 8.5 by 11, I drew a similar proportioned frame so that I could figure out proportions, composition, positive, negative space. When I was drawing my shapes, I did some really quick, rough shading, and I always went around the silhouette of that form to emphasize it. Does that make sense? So that helps me figure out the positive, negative space a little bit better. So I did 4. If you don't find one you like in 4, do more. And you see these little arrows here. Those are where I envision the light source to be coming from. Drafting down on marker paper, creating my horizon line, vanishing points, and my light source. So I just chose a corner to start with and worked from there. So I'm just creating a cube. There's a little sphere at the bottom, and just figuring out how I want those shapes to come together. And as you progress in your own exercise, if you need help figuring out where in a sphere or a square that shape would kind of intersect, I can help you with that. But I basically just drew a line up from where I thought it would be aligned and then do that little arc to show the edge where the sphere and the cube met. And I did just freehand the spheres based on proportions. And so now I'm just going over it with ink. And I started with a .01 pen, I believe. It may have been actually .005. I ended up going over that twice because the .005 was just a little too light when I erased my pencil underneath. So I'm just going back over it again to darken those edges. So now I'm starting to calculate my shadows. And I did struggle with this, figuring out where the sphere is above the cube and just finding that. And my shadow does go off the page, which is fine. But again, there is no right answer. You have to kind of sit there and figure out each of the points. Does that make sense? So halfway through this video, the shading will change. So I started shading with the very light pen that was running out of ink. So we have a very light shadow here. It depends on your style. I think that the depth is always, or the sense of depth is always stronger the higher the contrast. So I tend to exaggerate the difference between light and shadow because I feel that makes it look more realistic as opposed to creating a soft gradient, especially when we're using a black and white image or creating a black and white image. Does that make sense? So you'll see I go back and darken that up a bit in a second. And I did that wrong. I went back and fixed it. So you will see how I struggle through this just as much as y'all do. So. And when you're drawing it, there will come a time where it starts to click and things will start coming together a little bit easier once you have enough points. It's kind of like getting the edges of the puzzle. Then you can get the inside parts. So there's where I start to fix that. And there's where I made the mistake. That back cube is supposed to be floating, but I drew the shadow as if it was on the ground. And so what that is, I was darkening it up with a brush pen. So that's a really nice way to get that strong contrast, but you have to be careful because since that brush bends, you can get too dark a value too soon. So I traced over this after I did part of it because at first I didn't like it with the brush nib. So you see I traced over it and I'm going back over, being more careful with my lines. Looking back at it, I kind of like the brush nib now. So I would say try a couple different mediums because you might like it, you might not. And once you have this form done, you can make copies of it and shade the copies before you do your final, if that helps, so you can kind of experiment without ruining your finished piece. So that was one way. If you want really finalized ink drawing, use a straight edge. A triangle would be better than a ruler. If you are working on something that is more sketchy, you can do it freehand. So I did both to show you those two techniques. And when you're sketching, if you understand that the shadows for spheres and how the cube's shadows and cylinder shadows work, you can sketch that in without having to calculate every point, right? And then here I'm using a really crappy marker, so when you see the hard copy, you'll see why the better quality marker, the better your rendering will look. But I just used a marker to fill in the shadow to kind of go over the back of these a little bit more and increase that value. And then I started to kind of shade that. So that's the finished piece. So That being said, you can see crappy markers tend to look really splotchy, and they will lift up the pigment. So Prismacolors won't do that as much. This is just a marker I got sent to me, so it's not very good. And then you can see here, this cube is supposed to be floating, but I drew the shadow as if it was on the ground. So when I show you the hard copy, you can see that I drew the pencil lines in where it would be fixed, but I wasn't about to go back and do all that over again.